Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Commerce Architecture Overview. My name is AJ, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of the recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenter or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenter will be responding to your questions throughout the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now onto the presentation. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Reza Asadi, Principal Engineering Manager. Reza, over to you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, AJ, for the introduction. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I want to welcome you all to the talk today on Dynamics 365 Commerce Architecture. My name is Reza Sadi, and I'm part of our customer success and growth team driving our customer and partner success initiatives. And I have also with me Yegor Denisov, who is our principal architect on the Dynamics 365 Commerce team. He will probably be answering some of your questions as we go through the talk. Couple call-outs as we look at the agenda today. So we will cover obviously the architecture overview. So just the overall landscape, 20,000-foot view of what our architecture looks like. One of the greatest strengths of our architecture is obviously our integration with a lot of the Microsoft and Dynamics app ecosystem. So we will go a little bit into detail on what the integrations looks like and what layer they are made from and how they look. Then we'll obviously look at the topology because again, looking at Dynamics for Commerce is a distributed system. It's there are in-store components, there is cloud components, digital commerce components. So kind of getting a good feel for what that topology looks like is something that we're going to go into. Headless commerce, just because it's such a central piece to our architecture, and we'll get to that in a second as well. We'll go a little bit into detail on that. We'll handpick a couple components that we'll talk about, just because again, those are very key. Like our point of sale solution is a very central piece in our store and brick and mortar solution. So we want to go and understand that. And then we'll wrap up everything with what our extensibility story looks like, which I think is for partners, obviously a very interesting point. What are the things that you can customize and how does that get rolled out? How does that get packaged? And we'll wrap up with some resources and additional information. A couple other call-outs for folks who are listening in as well. There is a different tech talk that's going to go into a lot of detail on our digital commerce experience and e-commerce. That's a tech talk that's coming next week. So it's an area that we're not going to cover in depth about in this specific presentation. So we'll set the framework and we'll set the context for that presentation here, so to explain how digital commerce fits into our overall architecture, but we won't be going into a lot of detail there because that other talk will go into detail. And then the second thing is there's been a presentation a couple of weeks ago by Brendan Sullivan, one of the PMs on our team, to provide a holistic overview of what commerce is and what the solution provides. And that's another talk that we would encourage you to go and view if you haven't done so already. If you're watching this later on online, the recording, just go watch that talk as well before you watch this one. It gives a lot of context on what our solution looks like. So with that being said, let's jump right into the overall highlight of our architecture. And the first section or the first category of components that we want to look at in our architecture are the different user experiences that we provide, because that's really the entry point for our solution today and for how end users actually interact with the system. So we want to just go through those. And it starts really with, most of you might be familiar with the finance and operations application. So this is both our traditional ERP solution where you can access capabilities like finance, supply chain, and other components, other modules that are in a traditional ERP. But then it also currently hosts our call center experience, which is a first-class end user experience for commerce. It's a first-class native channel, as well as the commerce headquarters, where you can go and configure your channels, where you can go and configure your your overall e-commerce and digital commerce end-to-end omni-channel experiences. So, and I'll go ahead, and for folks on the call who haven't seen that, we'll just pull that up real quick. So this is, let me just refresh this real quick. This is what the Dynamics Finance and Operations application looks like. In this specific case, we've actually trimmed it down to what the Commerce HQ experience would look like. So if you're a back office persona, if you need to set up, for example, your pricing and your discounts, if you need to set up like your retail IT and commerce IT, this is the application. It's a browser-based application that you would go through, and it has tons and tons of modules that you can use to really do that configuration. It's a browser application, as you can see. It's called out over here. So that's something where we just want you guys to have a good feel for what that looks like. Then I'll skip over this one for a second. Then the next application that we provide today out of box is our point of sale solution. And our point of sale solution comes in multiple flavors. It can either come as a browser application, or it can come as a cross-platform application, meaning you can host it as a native application on Windows, iOS, and Android. And we'll get into those details a little bit later. And this is, again, what you would install in your store today to run your business, your retail operations. Now, we call it the point of sale solution today because that's really where it kind of emerged from, and that's where it's developed from. But the reality is that it provides a lot more than just point of sale capability. So we're doing native integration with Microsoft Teams, for example. We're doing some clienteling scenarios on this point of sale application. So it's really developing more and more into a real commerce store application where you can do productivity workflows, where you can do clienteling workflows, where you can do actual checkout workflows. So it's developing into that. But again, just for product truth today, it is still referred to as a point of sale application. And just to kind of skip over there, so this is the browser version of it that you can see. So again, lots of omni-channel capabilities, oral fulfillments, scenarios, for example, lots of analytics scenarios, for example, reports where we integrate with Power BI, and you can immediately in the application see information about your sales data. And then obviously merchandising scenarios where you can go ahead and just browse the product catalog. You can look at different products that are available along with inventory information, price check. So it's a pretty rich application. And as we said, like there's more and more modules that we are adding over time that go beyond traditional retail and more into also clienteling scenarios that are being embedded in this application. Then the next channel that we support is our e-commerce storefront, which is a website. So as part of our overall omni-channel solution, obviously digital commerce is a really important part. And we have now, starting earlier this year, a native application that we provide as part of our solution offering. And the website is actually built on top of our e-commerce rendering layer, which is based on Azure Web Apps and Node.js. And when we talk about the extensibility of this component, it's kind of critical to know kind of these technologies that we use there. And if I go over here to show you guys a sample website, for example, that we have. This is our demo website. It's called it's our Fabricam website. So as you can see, it's a full-blown e-commerce solution. You can go again browse the product catalog. As I click here, as it's loading, you can browse the product catalog. In this case, there's unfortunately no products available over here, but you can also go and do a full-blown like checkout experience. You can check prices, you can see your order history, everything you would expect from an e-commerce website. And here's, for example, one of our customers' e-commerce websites. You can see the richness of what is possible on our solution and the kind of user experiences that you can build. And the website itself, it's not mentioned over here, but the framework that we use is React. And then lastly, specifically for our digital commerce solution, we also have our e-commerce site builder experience where a marketing person or a content management person can go and actually interact and like design their pages. And I'll show you guys that as well, just so you get a good feel for what that looks like. This is the site builder experience. So you can see, for example, we let you go modify and view the pages that are published, page fragments, media library. You can change your layouts. You can go and again browse the product catalog that we have available over here. In this case, Yeah, I apologize for that. Usually it should show up here. I don't know why that error is happening, but you can technically see the exact same products, the exact same catalogs that we have in the point of sale solution and that you just saw on the e-commerce website, also in the site builder experience, which again is a browser application. So very important to note, and I kind of said it throughout the talk, is all of these experiences are fully omni-channel natively. So meaning that they all use the same product catalog, they all use the same order information, and a customer can just pick these up and configure them and get them up and running without any integrations or any custom built integrations between these components. Which really brings me to the second point, which is this headless commerce as a centralized integration point between all these different channels. So we kind of walk through all these user experiences, and to see like what the backbone of these user experiences is, there's really two components to it. There is obviously the back office service, which is our Dynamics Finance and Operations app, which is built on Service Fabric and Azure SQL. This is where this user experience that we looked at a little bit earlier is built on top of. These are the set of services that we support. But then really most of the other capabilities and most of the other services and applications that we have really built on top of what we call the headless commerce, which consists of our commerce scale unit, which is the central web service that hosts all our business logic for our channel side components. It's based on Azure Web App and Azure SQL when it's actually hosted within the cloud, but there's also a flavor of it that's hosted on-prem that's actually using IIS services and SQL Server. Sorry, SQL Server is missing here, but it should have called that out. Then in addition to that, in order to power our digital commerce experience, we also have our content management system that we discussed a little bit earlier. And that in itself consists of both a content management system and actual digital asset management experience. Both of those are built on top of Cosmos DB. That's just a technical detail because customers and partners who want to interact with it, there is no extensibility here, but there's an API layer that can be consumed. That's how this is exposed. And then lastly, we also have a ratings and review service that's part of our headless commerce, where you can just pick up the service. It natively integrates with our rendering stack, but obviously can be also consumed independently. And lastly, our recommendation service that powers a lot of the end user experiences that are connected to all these different user experiences via our commerce scale unit. And over time, really, this commerce scale unit is the central point of the integration in many ways, with the exception of the headless CMS, because that's where really all these client applications and all these client user experiences are connected to. Now, we talked a little bit about extensibility, and we really want to also look at that in the bigger picture. So if you have any third-party application or service and you really want to have the same omni-channel experiences, you can go ahead and build those experiences on top of our commerce scale unit and really as part of the overall headless commerce, and really leverage and tap into those same capabilities. So you would see the same pricing information, the same product catalog, you can look at the same orders, and you can really integrate these omni-channel scenarios and extend what we already support, maybe through a social application or a third-party e-commerce website if you don't want to use the e-commerce solution that we offer. On the flip side of that, if you have a third-party service that provides omni-channel capabilities like a tax service, a shipping service, a payment service, you can build those integrations on top of the commerce scale unit, and they will then again become available in an omni-channel fashion across all these different client experiences and user experiences that we have. So with that being said, again, a central piece to our solution, we also want to talk a little bit about data and how you can tap into the data of this entire solution. So the two components or the two services that we integrate with that are really key here is obviously one, the common data service. So for everyone who is familiar with the Power Platform, you know that that's really the central store for all your business data. And the way that that integration works today is via the Dynamics 365 back office. There is a dual write capability that we support that synchronizes data periodically from the finance and operations application down to the common data service. One thing that we forgot to mention, again, in the context of the headless commerce, because the ERP today is independent from the headless commerce, is there is two integration points between the commerce scale unit and the finance and operations application. One is a real-time integration. So if you need to do any real-time operations on any of your channels that rely on data in the finance and operations application, any of those applications can, via the commerce scale unit, make that real-time call to, for example, check things like a gift card balance, or check things like customer information or order information. At the same time, we also have a periodic data sync that's configured between these two components fully natively, and customers can choose to configure to run every 5, 10 minutes, every hour, or every day, that periodically synchronizes transactional data back into the finance and operations application, but then also master record data back into the commerce scale unit. That means that ultimately the finance and operations application as of today is the central data source and the central source of truth for all the transactional and master record data. Now, from here, as we just discussed, we also do the to the data sync via the dual write capabilities into the common data service, which powers really a lot of the rest of the Dynamics ecosystem. But at the same time, we also can set up integrations into Azure Data Lake, which in turn then can be used to create reports, integrate with Power BI, and integrate with any other kind of third-party like solution that you might have built on top of the data. And really, in the spirit of really using these capabilities ourselves, we also have set up the integration from Azure Data Lake for a lot of our transactional data into our recommendation service in order to power that AI. So we rely on that same transactional data for us to give that level of product recommendation, and we also leverage just exactly the same infrastructure that we provide externally. So it really, we help make that flow better. Now, as we discussed, because it's built on top of the common data service, and that's the unified data layer that we provide, that whole interconnected business experiences with the other Dynamics applications like Dynamics Sales, Marketing, Customer Service, Fraud Protection, and Customer Insights is all fully integrated through this integration point. So this is something, again, if you're familiar with these applications, this is where we kind of flow the data back, and you can set up these interconnected business processes. The opposite is obviously true as well. So if you're already an existing partner or customer that has built a practice on top of these applications via the common data service, you can actually make that wealth of data available back into the commerce ecosystem and really use it to power your channels, whether it's a point of sale application, a storefront, or traditional ERP. Lastly, we also want to talk about the fact that besides the Dynamics ecosystem, we're also tightly integrated with other Microsoft services. And really two that we want to call out here, and there is more that are both coming and that are being developed right now, is one is Microsoft Bing for Commerce, which we use for our product recommendations or product search capabilities. So again, like if you have any kind of product search in your point of sale solution, in your e-commerce storefront, in order to make that both contextually relevant and contextually relevant, and actually also have strong performance there, we leverage Microsoft Bing for Commerce because they know how to do search really, really well. At the same time, we also have integrations with Microsoft Teams, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, for productivity kind of scenarios. So if you have notification, task management for your employees in the store, this is Microsoft Teams integration works natively with our solution, and you can leverage those capabilities as well. So again, a fully natively integrated omni-channel set of experiences that you can get without any custom code, without any custom integrations, out of box in our solution today, really built primarily on top of our headless commerce capabilities, where you can expose these business logic that we've developed, as well as any third-party integrations and third-party or first-party native services that we expose to all your different channels, all natively integrated already out of box with our unified data solution, both with common data service that powers our additional Dynamics 365 applications and Azure Data Lake Storage, which powers some of your analytics scenarios. And then again, first-class integrations with other Microsoft services that you guys already might be using and might be getting tons of value from. So with that said, and the last point that we really wanted to highlight here again is also it's all fully powered by AI. So between our recommendation service, which is our first-class service, as well as Microsoft Bing for Commerce, this AI is being injected into the whole system through the commerce scale unit, and again, something that powers all our omni-channel experiences. With that being said, we also want to talk a little bit, because it's the architecture talk, about the nature of these different components and how they behave and how you should really think about them. And the way that you should think about them is really in three categories. It's components that are on-prem, and you're, as a customer or you as a partner, will manage the application lifecycle of those applications. Then there is a second category of applications which are hosted in the cloud, and the customer still manages the application lifecycle of those applications. And then lastly, applications that are hosted in the cloud but are fully managed by Microsoft. And what we really mean here is that these are multi-tenant services that Microsoft manage from an infrastructure perspective. Microsoft manages the deployment and the servicing, and Microsoft fully manages the monitoring and alerting and maintenance of those systems. So this is something where you can just tap into right away, and you don't really have to worry much about how these are managed. Like, we just give you those capabilities out of box, but at the same time, these are also non-extensible because we control the application lifecycle. There is no good mechanism today for you to go and do any customization there, and in many ways, that's really also not really needed. These components, on the other hand, are, again, the monitoring and the infrastructure are managed by Microsoft, meaning we make sure that these services run, we make sure that they're properly monitored and maintained, but you as a customer actually manage the ALM of them, meaning you can decide when you want to take up a new version, you can decide when you roll out, like, for example, when you roll out a new customization on top of them. And the main reason why you control the ALM of these applications today is because they're tightly changed or tightly are integrated with those end user experiences. So for example, if we're rolling out new capabilities in the point of sale and you're going through a test pass and you want to control when those changes are being actually rolled out, this is why you control the ALM on these components. And then some of these components today are single tenant and single instance, meaning, for example, for finance and operations or e-commerce, you have one instance globally that for these two components that basically all your data lives in. However, there are other components which are single tenant. So again, like, you own your own component and you own that service, but they're actually multi-instance, meaning you can scale them out globally. So the point of sale application, the commerce scale unit, are two examples of that. So if you have distributed brick and mortar stores across the world, you can go ahead and spin up different commerce scale units to just have the geo proximity for those services. And again, obviously your point of sale solution would then be also built on top of that. For the on-prem managed ones, again, the point of sale is the obvious one. So you manage these are on your devices and you control them. Again, it could be a Windows application, iOS or Android application. But in some cases, because of connectivity and other reasons, we see a need for you to actually host the commerce scale unit, that central piece of that architecture, on your own prem. And then in that case, we make the exact same capabilities available for you to self-host. But at that point, again, obviously it's single tenant and single instance, but really you manage the infrastructure, you manage most of the monitoring, even though we have capabilities to do remote monitoring and troubleshooting as well for these components. One thing that's worth calling out, and we'll get into that a little bit later, is some of the integration points that we have on the commerce scale unit today rely on cloud components and cloud infrastructure. In those cases, if that capability isn't available on-prem, because the commerce scale unit is so composable, you can plug in and plug out these different integrations based on where it is being hosted. And we'll get into that in a little bit later, but there could be a difference between what this component looks like from the capabilities that you leverage and enable when it's hosted on-prem versus when it's hosted in the cloud. So this should hopefully give you a good inventory of all the different services, what the nature of those services are, how they behave, who manages them, how they are controlled, and also all the technology stack that it's built on top of. Because in some cases, from an extensibility scenario, it's important to kind of understand that we leverage a lot of the Azure Web App infrastructure, Node.js, and Azure SQL, and obviously DocDB in the vast majority of our scenarios. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about the integration points, because as we saw a little bit earlier, that's really core to our strategy, and it's really core to our business value. So we wanted to call out all the different integrations beyond the few that we saw on the first slide that we enable for any one of our services and applications. And we'll start with the point of sale application. There are really two major Microsoft products that we integrate with here. One is Power BI. So it's embedded inside that point of sale application. We even showed it to you guys a little bit earlier, but you can go and look at the in-store reports. So that's one integration that natively just works throughout the application. And then we have Microsoft Teams for tasks and notifications within the store. Then on the e-commerce storefront, we have a native integration now with Power Virtual Agent. So that's our chatbot capabilities, where if you're a consumer and you're browsing through the website, we can bring up that chatbot where you can ask questions and integrate directly with Power Virtual Agent, where you can go and in that application basically configure the experience and kind of show what that looks like. But that native integration just works today out of box, and that's the layer where it's embedded in directly. And then the second component, it's a little bit of an infrastructure component, and over time we'll probably not show it in this kind of view, but today it's pretty relevant for our digital commerce experiences, Azure B2C, which is what we ultimately use for our consumer authentication. Then on the digital asset management and content management side, there are two integrations. One that is like in development right now, but we still called it out here, which is Power Automate. So if you want to set up any kind of workflow or any kind of streamlined process to go and interact with your content in a scaled out way, Power Automate is the way to go there. And again, you can go and create, we have a connector, so you can go and connect to this application and get that set up. And then we also use Azure Cognitive Services for any AI-based image tagging, so that when you're in that site builder experience, we can give you a little bit more AI, and it's really part of that experience as well. Again, over time, we would likely not show this because this is really just a native service that just powers over time, probably more and more applications in our ecosystem. Then Commerce Scale Unit, and really before I get into the detail, just as a reminder for folks who are new to our solution, this is really the central piece of the solution powering all the other channels. So anything that we power through the Commerce Scale Unit, again, becomes available in an omni-channel manner to all the different user experiences, including third-party applications. So the first one we want to highlight is Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection. The integration here is real time for what we call purchase protection. So if you imagine a user comes to the website, tries to do a checkout, we can hook up fraud protection to basically check that checkout, check that shopping cart, check the payment information and see if this is a fraudulent transaction or not, and then take action on it. Then we have the customer Dynamics 365 Customer Insights integration, where you can get notes about customers or next best action. That's again being made available to today primarily to the point of sale, but could be made available to other applications as well. We have an integration with Dynamics 365 Connected Store for dwell time. So if you're again like inside the store, we provide those capabilities. Bing for Commerce, we talked about a little bit earlier for product search. And then in addition to Bing for Commerce, we also use Azure Cognitive Services for product search capabilities. But this is really, we're calling it out here because it's somewhat of a new development that we rolled out earlier this year. But over time, this is really more infrastructure, and we'll likely not show it in this kind of diagram. And then lastly, as part of our finance and operations application, we have integrations with Microsoft Teams to publish the store and organizational hierarchy. So if you want to set up your channels and you want to set up your employees in Teams, but all that data already lives in finance and operation, publishing of that data can be done pretty natively. We also integrate with Power BI for back office reports on sales data, for example. And then, as we discussed a little bit earlier, Azure Data Lake storage for all your entities and transactional data, which in turn that actually powers also our Dynamics 365 fraud protection loss prevention scenario. So again, if you have a bunch of sales data about your in-store operations, you can publish that via Azure Data Lake into Dynamics 365 fraud protection. And in that case, we can then give you information about in-store loss information and like, for example, employees stealing money or goods. And then lastly, through the Common Data Service, we also do integrations with customer service, marketing, sales, field service, and all the other applications in the Dynamics ecosystem that you're already familiar with. With that, let's talk a little bit about the topology. So as we discussed, there are obviously some in-store components and on-prem components that we have, but then there is also a set of in-cloud components. And the really important thing about our architecture is that you can really mix and match these based on your needs. And if you have different requirements in different stores or globally across different regions, you really have full control over what this topology looks like and how you want to maintain it. And what we kind of wanted to draw here is what sample topology could look like for you. I'll start with the most easy one, which is all the multi-tenant services that are powering our e-commerce storefront and commerce scale unit. These are all multi-tenant, fully hosted in the cloud by us, Microsoft managed ALM. So you really don't have to worry about this at all as you think about your topology. However, for the point of sale commerce scale units, finance and operations application, and the e-commerce storefront rendering layer, you do have to worry about it. And really the three type of regions that you can have, or the three examples of setup that you can have is, the first one we talked about was everything is in your store. So let's say you have bad network, you just have very low tolerance for potential outages or for losing connectivity. You can have a point of sale solution that's hosted in your store, either the browser app or is a cross-platform app that's built on top of that commerce scale unit that's hosted on-prem, and you maintain it. It's hosted in IIS and SQL Server, and this is fully under your control. Then the second type of region that you could have, as we talked about as part of your scale out story, is you could have a commerce scale unit built based on Azure Web Apps and Azure SQL, and your point of sale browser and cross-platform application just connects to that cloud component. And again, like if you have multiple stores that are connected to it, they will all share the same transactional data at that point, and they can they're fully integrated in that way. And then you could have your what we call headquarter region, meaning that's where your real finance and operations application lives, and along with with your headquarters. In a lot of cases, your commerce, your rendering stack would likely also, for your e-commerce digital experience, would also be in the same region, even though it doesn't have to be. So this e-commerce rendering layer could be in any other region as well. And then again, in this same region, you could be hosting multiple commerce scale units, one dedicated to your e-commerce store rendering, and another one dedicated to your point of sale operations. Maybe you want to choose that topology so that you can independently service these. So maybe you want to roll out different versions in your e-commerce storefront more quickly than in your store, so you want to separate that. Or maybe you just, for scale reasons, want to split these up so that you can scale independently based on the load that you generate in each one of these. Now, if you take this picture and kind of just look at it globally, this is really what it would look like. So you could have, again, like a region where you have it self-hosted, you maintain the data center, you maintain the server, you have your stores connected here. You could have a secondary region where you run your brick and mortar operations. You have a dedicated commerce scale unit, that's where it's running. And then lastly, you'll have a third region where your headquarters is, your rendering layer for your e-commerce, and your scale unit. And again, you could have more brick and mortar stores connected to this region as well. Now, one question that we get asked quite a bit is, if your e-commerce rendering layer is currently hosted in just one region, what does that look like when you have visitors from around the world? And the first call that we would like to make out there is that architecturally, we have the capability to host this component in multiple regions. The missing piece here is really the ALM story. So making sure that the deployment infrastructure is in place so customers can do this at scale. And that's something that we're actively working on. But today, that's the main limitation, but architecturally, there's no reason why this has to be limited to one region. Second of all, because there is also today a tighter coupling between one commerce scale unit and one rendering layer, we unfortunately do not have the capability to connect to multiple commerce scale units, which means you ultimately have to do that round trip anyways to that one specific commerce scale unit to get all your product data, all your order history, all that other information. So whether you, as from your browser, make that call to the e-commerce rendering layer that's hosted locally, but then have to make that second hop to another region for the commerce scale unit, or both of them live in the same region, based on our current architecture, that's there is no big difference. That's why this is only supported in one region today. Again, it's a limitation that we're actively working on resolving so that even this component can be scaled out over time. So that's what the geo distribution looks like. And with that, really, because we talk so much about this headless commerce and this commerce scale unit, we really want to kind of look at what that architecture looks like and what we provide there. And I'll start with this component in the middle, and then I'll branch out to the sides. But really, there are 4 layers, if you think about it, in this commerce scale unit. First, there is an Azure Web App or IIS web service, which we mentioned multiple times now, that hosts the actual commerce scale unit web service. And then there is a second layer, which is our data layer, which is hosted in either Azure SQL or SQL Server based on whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. If you look at the actual service, it consists of 3 layers. So one layer is the OData endpoint, where we have all our OData APIs. broken down by the different controllers, both the ones that we natively support, for example, a search controller, payments, cards, pricing, or any third-party controllers that you want to export yourself. Could be, for example, a shipping controller, which we don't support at all in our current native solution or don't provide as a native capability in our solution, but also something where, for example, we do have a tax controller and a tax service, but you might still want to override it and add your own controllers here as well. And that's something that we support. Then we have a set of middlewares. So think about the middlewares as these are libraries embedded in the service. This is not its own standalone microservice, but this is really for each of these web services, whether it's hosted on-prem or in the cloud. We natively provide authentication capabilities, authorization capabilities, exception handling. So really, you don't have to worry about it as you develop your extensions. And then lastly, which is the heart of this headless commerce, is our commerce runtime, which consists of all the different services that we natively support, as well as all the third-party services that you might be developing on your own. And for the ones that we natively support, they can really fall into two categories. Either those are services that we, so first of all, the two category, like one level of categorization is just services that we use for business logic, and then services that we use for connectivity and data access. So again, you could have something like a caching service here that any one of your business logic services can tap into, that where you can basically use to cache data, for example, or we have a SQL data service where you can interact with the SQL database and it's reusable by all the other services. So these are more like infrastructure services that we provide, including one that makes the real-time calls to the finance and operations application. So this transaction service is the one that does that. But then you also have all your business logic services, and these actually also break down into two categories. Those that rely on external integration. So for example, a search service might be making a call to Bing for Commerce, a fraud protection service will make a call to Dynamics 365 fraud protection, or services that just solely rely on the data that's hosted locally within this within our channel database. And again, these can interact with each other. So if you're making a search call, but then also want to calculate the prices of the goods that you're showing, obviously these can embed each other and they can make calls across each other. And that's what you can also leverage all the existing services that we have when you write your own third-party services that you want to hook up. And then lastly, on the channel database, again, we have three different schemas that we support here. One is our what we call our commerce runtime schema. That's a schema that really powers a lot of these different services that we natively support today. Then we have our commerce HQ schema, which contains all the data that's being synchronized from the finance and operations application. And we have another slide on just data synchronization that's coming up in a little bit. But then also lastly, the extension schema that we have that powers some of these extension services that, again, could either make direct calls here down to this extension schema and store the data locally, or make outbound calls to any of our services that we provide. Lastly, if you have incoming requests from different applications, we have two proxies that we ship today as part of our application. One that's embedded in all our own native applications, which is called the TypeScript proxy. So our e-commerce storefront, our point of sale, they both use this proxy today to make calls to our headless commerce. But then these can actually also be embedded in your own third-party application. But then at the same time, we also have a C# proxy, which none of our own applications use today, but you can embed in your own third-party native application or app service that again makes calls to the headless commerce service. So that's what really like the detailed architecture of this component looks like. Again, fully composable. You can plug in and plug out whatever it is that you need, and really lots of capabilities that you can natively tap into. With that, we want to talk a little bit about the commerce runtime, and I just noticed there's a typo here, but we talked about the commerce runtime in this architecture. Again, remember that's this piece where we host all these different services, and we want to give you guys a little bit of an overview of what that looks like when it's hosted in different places. And two scenarios we already talked about is in the cloud-hosted and self-hosted commerce scale unit, but then there is a third scenario where even our own modern point of sale, our own point of sale application uses the commerce commerce runtime for offline capabilities. So for example, imagine you're in a store, you lose connectivity. If you have point of sale capabilities on that register, you don't want to lose the power of all these capabilities. Now, for some of the scenarios that rely on connectivity, for example, we talked about a recommendation service or a search service, for example, you might not be able to use the full power of the cloud at that point, but you still want to tap into all that other business logic that's hosted. So one thing that we want to call out here is, again, the symmetry in the architecture. So we have the commerce runtime on top of the channel database in all these different scenarios. In the case of the point of sale, it's the same channel database, but really hosted as an offline database. So these are capabilities that we have. And you as a customer or as a partner don't really have to worry about, like, what does this internal architecture look like? What does the hosting of it looks like? We do all the heavy lifting, so you can really just develop and leverage the capabilities and do your extension scenarios on top of it. The second thing that we want to call out is that, again, it's fully composable, meaning on the cloud, you can have a set of common extensions that you develop that work independently from the hosting application. But as we talked a little bit earlier, if you have an application that relies on cloud capabilities, you can go and extend those and embed those into your cloud-hosted scale unit. But when you host the same scale unit on-prem, you might want to replace those with on-prem implementations of the same extension. So you have that capability to break that down. And even in the modern POS offline scenarios, you can further extend that and have your offline specific extensions hosted in here as well, while leveraging all the other common extensions that work across application side by side. So you have full control over that. And then all these extensions, as we talked about a little bit earlier, are highly extensible with request handlers, meaning you can use our own out-of-box services across all of these. You can override our out-of-box services with your own implementations. You can plug in as post and pre-triggers before or after our code is executed. Lots of flexibility that you have here. Again, fully based on which kind of topology you're hosting and where that application is hosted. So really, the goal here is that we enable you to do your implementation once, or to implement these different components once, and learn how the business flows work once, but then we distribute it into all these different scenarios. With that, there's a couple components that we want to get into a little bit of detail on. And one of the, again, like we talked about it so much, is our point of sale application. So we did want to talk a little bit about the architecture of what that looks like, specifically as it comes in different flavors. And again, also highlight once more the symmetry in our architecture, meaning how we develop things only once, and we allow you to also write your extensions only once, and then make sure that they're available in as many places as possible. So we already talked at the modern POS architecture, which consists of the Windows application powered by a SQL Express or SQL Server for the offline database. Again, you can have our own out-of-box schema here, or our extension schema. Our commerce runtime could have our own out-of-box services and extension services. And in the there's another component that we haven't talked too much about, and we won't get into a lot of detail on this call, but it's also a hardware station where you do peripheral integration, where again, we provide a set of out-of-box connectors for very common OPOS, for example, payment OPOS devices, or for example, our Adyen payment connector is in here. But then again, you can very easily go and write your own extension connectors that connect to any kind of peripheral that you want to do. These two layers, along with, so there's also our UI layer, which is fully HTML JavaScript based for our Windows application. Again, we have a set of out-of-box pages and controls that we support. And once again, you have full control over the extensibility here, and you can go and write your own extension pages, your own extension controls. And these two layers talk to each other via our native client broker that we have. So any kind of, again, offline scenarios or hardware integration that you want to do would go via this specific client broker. Now, for our cloud point of sale solution, we take the exact same out-of-box pages and controls that are embedded directly into this application here, and we actually host them in our commerce scale unit as a set of artifacts that are accessible by different applications. The first and foremost important one here is that obviously the cloud point of sale, where the browser can just directly interact or download this content from the web, and a user can see it. And really, if we go back to this experience that we saw a little bit earlier, this is exactly what's happening here. So we're connecting to the URL for our commerce scale unit, and that's really where the HTML JavaScript for the point of sale solution is hosted. Obviously, for all the server calls, it goes back to the Commerce Scale Unit web service that we talked about a little bit earlier. Now, the way that we support our iOS point of sale native application is almost in a very similar way, where we have a native shell that we publish, and then that UI layer, that content that's being rendered in that iOS application comes fully from the cloud, from that Commerce Scale Unit. So from an application lifecycle perspective, you really don't have to change the shell often. You can actually uptake new user experience across your point of sale by just updating your Commerce Scale Unit, and you don't have to update this native shell unless there is some very concrete capability that we might want to expose over time that requires a new shell update. Otherwise, this will work seamlessly. Now, as you can imagine, though, the one downside or the one flip side of this architecture is that there is no native offline capability that we support for the iOS point of sale. So this is online only mode, and because it relies on the content from the cloud, and it's not hosted within the application in the application itself, the same strength that gives you that that flexibility and updating this independently is also what limits you in order to use offline capabilities, at least today. Lastly, our Android point of sale is a bit of a hybrid of what we saw with the modern point of sale, which is Windows-based, and the iOS-based one, in that we, again, don't host the actual content of the application or the actual user experience natively on the application, and it instead comes from the Commerce Scale Unit. So once again, also there is no offline capability, but at the same time, we have actually embedded hardware station integration into the Android app, meaning if you want to do any kind of hardware integration here, you can do it natively through the hardware station, through either our own out-of-box connectors or extension connectors. The way that you do hardware integration, again, there should be a box down here that's missing right now, but the way that you would do hardware integration from the cloud point of sale or the iOS point of sale is via a component that we call the shared hardware station. And again, in the spirit of symmetry, it's the exact same binaries that we host natively into these applications, but it's just hosted as an IaaS service that these applications can connect to. But in the case of the Android point of sale, just to remove the requirement for that component, we have already started to natively embed hardware station inside that application. Now, the reason why we don't expose those capabilities today in the iOS is not a product decision, because we do think that those same capabilities should be here. It's just a roadmap discussion, meaning we just haven't done the work to make it portable on iOS as well. And the reason why I picked Android was just because there was more demand at the time where we developed this for the Android solution than there was for the iOS solution. But this is something that's in our roadmap, and that's a capability that's coming and really true to the vision of how we think these applications should behave. And even with offline capabilities over time, we would look at options that would allow us to bring those capabilities to even an Android or iOS-based application. It's just a longer roadmap discussion that we will have to have. The second component detail that we wanted to get into is really the data sync framework, because again, we talk so much about the headless commerce, but then at the same time, the ERP solution that's hosted in the back office. So we just wanted to make sure that folks understood really what that data synchronization model looks like. And the way to read this diagram, I know it looks a little bit busy, but once we get into the detail, it'll become a little bit more manageable to kind of consume this, is everything that you see that's blue, light blue, is our primary back office data that we synchronize. And that is mostly, again, remember that data is entered in the back office application. So whether it's my product catalog, whether it's my pricing information, all of that is basically developed in the back office, and that gets synchronized into the channel database via the headless commerce into all the different channel flows. Transactional data obviously will flow the other way, right? Like you take orders on your point of sale, on your e-commerce storefront. Once you take those orders, that data needs to get synchronized back to your ERP, which is the single source of truth as of today for all that transactional data. So everything that you see is yellow is basically that flow. It's the transactional data flow. So I'll start over here in the back office. So obviously we have our Commerce HQ table. So this is your master record data, pricing, discount, catalog data. We then have a component which is a set of data synchronization classes. So that's X++ code that's hosted within this finance and operations app runtime. If you don't know what X++ code is, there is lots of information out there on just the finance and operations app architecture, which unfortunately we can't really get into a lot of detail in today's talk, but you can go and read up on that. but those classes will basically generate zip files and CSV files that contain that data that's stored in an Azure blob. And from that Azure blob, it then gets synchronized into all these different components. So the easiest one is obviously the Commerce Scale Unit. That's the cloud-hosted components. We have an Azure batch service that's running running on the Commerce Scale Unit that periodically connects to this blob storage, downloads the data, uses a set of Commerce data sync libraries that are C# classes to both synchronize that data down to the channel database, where it's being made available by our Commerce runtime that's being exposed to all the different client experiences. But at the same time, we also use the exact same data sync framework to power our Azure Cognitive Services or Bing for Commerce search indexes. Then on the Commerce Scale Unit, which is self-hosted, the way it works is you have to host your own Windows service. And when I say your own, it's our window, you host it, but it's our component, our data sync client component that's running on this machine. Again, same Commerce data sync libraries, again, full symmetry between these two components that download the data from this blob, synchronize it in the local on-prem version of the channel database, that's SQL Server, that's then powering our Commerce runtime hosted in IIS. On the modern point of sale for offline scenarios, again, the same thing. On the native layer of the Windows application, we have the same Commerce data sync libraries. They download the exact same packages. They apply the exact same packages to the offline database, which really is the same schema as the channel database. It's just hosted on this machine. Now, for transactional data, the way that it works is, again, the two easy scenarios in online mode, you basically make requests to the Commerce Scale Unit or to the Commerce via the Commerce runtime, either on-prem or on the cloud. It creates the transactional data that's stored in the channel database, either here on the prem version or here in the cloud version. And then the same Commerce data sync libraries pick up that data set and store it as zip files and CSV files in this Azure blob. This same data synchronization classes then pick up those files and store them here in your back office database. And again, from here, you can then via either dual write, synchronize the data to the common data service, or just export it natively into ADLS. In the case of offline database, so let's say you lose connectivity here for this point of sale solution, we start to store transactional data here in the offline database. So that's where that gets stored. Once the device comes back online, the native layer here, the same Commerce data sync libraries, will bulk upload any transaction that's stored in this offline database and just upload it again as transactions into this Commerce Scale Unit. The reason we picked this architecture rather than uploading them directly from the Windows application is that once the data lives in the Commerce Scale Unit, any other point of sale solution that's connected to that scale unit now has access to that data. So for example, if you just walked into the store, you did a transaction and it was happening in offline mode, and 2 minutes later you walk back and you want to do a return against the same transaction, but you go to another register, because the data is stored on this channel database, once the device comes back online, you will be able to execute that scenario. You don't have to rely on that transaction to get synchronized all the way back to the back office and make it available through a real-time call. So the data lives more locally against that scale unit. So this is what the data synchronization framework looks like. Again, a lot of dependencies across the stack on this. So we wanted to make sure folks had a really good understanding of how that works. And again, the part that we're not showing here, but kind of is implied based on the previous slides we saw, this back office is where you then take all the master record data, all the transactional data today, as per our current architecture, and synchronize it down to other components, other Dynamics 365 applications, Power Platform. This is where really that happens. This shows you kind of how all the data across the system gets synchronized back into the system, as well as distributed to all the end user experiences that we have on this side. With that, we want to talk just briefly about our extensibility scenarios. Obviously, there will be a lot more talks that we will have that go into a lot more detail on each one of these scenarios. But we wanted you to have a really good understanding of what that flow looks like. Like, how do you go from our developer experience and our SDK? What do you compile? What are the artifacts that we generate, and how do you get them actually deployed? We wanted you to have a good high-level understanding of that. And really, the way that it breaks down is by 3 different types of extensions that we support today, and they are a function of the architecture that we had that we already went over. The first one is our finance and operations extension. So the way that this works today is the SDK is published as a VHD. So when you're in our application, you can go and you can provision a VHD through our lifecycle management experience, which we didn't show today, but is the central place where you do all your environment management. Here is also where you can spin up a developer box. On that developer box, our X++ object module is hosted as a Visual Studio extension. You then can go and create your own runtime and service extensions or database extensions. So this is your own developer environment where you can use the SDK to develop these extensions, and they get then at compile time packaged into an extension package. The reason this extension package is yellow and the way you should read it is it doesn't contain any kind of native code. So this is purely your extension code that's being packaged up here. And we're talking a little bit about why that's so important. In the case of our e-commerce solution, we again have an e-commerce developer environment. So this is a GitHub repository you can go and clone locally and start doing your development. We have a lot of mocks and demo data that's exposed within this SDK to just make it easier for you to develop. And there are two things that ship as part of this SDK. The SDK itself, meaning like all the core artifacts that you're coding against, which includes APIs and other things, and that TypeScript proxy that we talked about a little bit earlier is also embedded in that SDK. But then we actually also give you a set of modules, themes, and data actions, that's again JavaScript and HTML, that basically allows you to get running and get started with your developer experience much faster, and we really call that the SSK in our case. The extensions that you can write on top of the e-commerce scenario is one, a configuration set of JSON files that control the behavior of the out-of-box modules, themes, and data actions that we provide. So here you can just go and flip a bit and really change what these modules do. At the same time, you can also go and develop your own modules, themes, and data actions using our SDK that are completely custom to your scenario, and you can go and develop these. When we then go and compile this component, we really compile it into what we call an e-commerce extension package that contains both your own customized modules, themes, and data actions along with the configuration file, but also all the out-of-box modules, themes that we provide to you. So that's the way how these actually get delivered. And if you really wanted to, even though we don't always encourage it, but there's something that you have full control over, you can customize these modules that we support out of box as well if you want to just tweak the behavior slightly. Lastly, we want to talk a little bit about our headless commerce and POS extensions. And again, as you saw, these two components in different variations are kind of tightly coupled together. So the way that this works is, again, you operate on the finance and operations VHD. So that's where you do your developer, that's where your developer experience happens. And the components that we exposed here is, again, the commerce runtime libraries that we already talked about at length, the channel database schema that's natively powering these different scenarios for the commerce runtime, and then the native POS UI and runtime, which is JavaScript and HTML, that basically has all the core pages and components that are natively embedded in our point of sale. And then for the commerce runtime and for the POS, we also ship a set of sample code that you can use in order to get started with your extensions. Again, in your developer environment, then you can go and create runtime and API extensions for your commerce runtime. So you remember when we broke down that commerce runtime, it showed all the yellow boxes. So those yellow boxes are really these extensions that you can develop. You can develop your SQL database extensions and your point of sale UI and runtime extensions. And what then happens at compile time is we really generate three types of packages. We create one package, which is our headless commerce extension package for cloud components, where we only take your extension code and we package it up. But then for the on-prem installer of the headless commerce component, so the one that you deploy locally on your own environment, the way that it works today is we package your extensions along with all our own core capabilities into one on-prem installer that has your database, has all our native point of sale solution or our native commerce runtime along with your extension code. Over the long term, obviously, we want you support independent packaging and independent servicing of the core installer logic and the extension packages. But as of today, that separation doesn't exist yet. It's in our roadmap. It's coming soon. But as of today, we still package both of them into one major installer. That also means, and this is a limitation of our service, if you want to uptake just new core capabilities, but you're not really changing your extensions, you have to, at the very least, update your SDK and repackage this component in order to get those core capabilities. And for the modern point of sale, it's exactly symmetric, right? So you have the same commerce runtime, the same channel database, same UI, along with your extensions that get packaged. Now, if you look about what happens, so take this box, right? All these different artifacts that we just generated, and you sorry about that, and you take them here and you look at where they're hosted, you can now see how they actually get deployed. And as we said, all the cloud components, whether it's your finance and operations application, your e-commerce solution, or your headless commerce hosted in the cloud, you just take these extension packages, you go via our Dynamics 365 Lifecycle Services, which is Microsoft-owned multi-tenant service, and you then deploy them to your own Dynamics finance and operations app, to your e-commerce rendering stack, or the cloud-hosted commerce scale unit. And these are independent service. So you can see the core components, which are blue, can be independently serviced from the extension packages. And we guarantee two-way compatibility. So you can rev your own component, like the core component, without breaking your extensions, or you can publish new extensions without publishing a new core component, as long as the extension is compiled against the version of the application that's the same or older than what's deployed. For the on-prem components, again, the reason why this is fully yellow is because this is technically a fully customized component at that point, where you can use an on-prem mass deployment infrastructure like SSCM, or Intune is something that a lot of our customers use to take these components and roll them out. You can even just install them manually by just connecting to a machine and getting them installed. But again, at that point, you have all our core capabilities inside these applications, but they're fully compiled by yourself. Again, there will be a lot more talks about our SDK and our developer experiences, but we just wanted to give you a high-level overview of how all these components that we talked about in our architecture really feed into this developer experience, so that as you go a little bit more depth, you kind of see the big picture and you see what are the architectural artifacts or principles that kind of led to this architecture of our developer experience. With that, we just kind of want to wrap up the call. So a couple of information we want to throw out there. Two more talks that are coming that kind of build on top of the lot of the content that we covered today is our e-commerce architecture deep dive. So Brian Shook and Petri Shimolin from our PM team will talk through that. That's next Tuesday. There are 2 sessions. Again, we didn't get into a lot of detail on digital commerce today, but that talk will be great. You can learn a lot more about our digital commerce solution, and a lot of the information you learned today will hopefully make you kind of be able to grasp that other data more easily. And we have another call that's coming in first week of January. So we just recently actually rescheduled that call. So the final date is to be determined, but we're going to talk about our commerce deployments, updates, and servicing. So today you kind of saw high level what that looks like, but Amr Alakaband and Petri Simolin will again go into a lot more detail on that. As far as articles are concerned, like obviously there's a wealth of documentation out there for our solution, but really the 5 that we want to highlight here are just our overall architecture documentation, some information about in-store topology, how to pick the right topology, and how that will manifest itself, a little bit more detail about our commerce scale unit architecture if you're interested in that, our modern point of sale architecture if you want to get a little bit more deep dive on that. There is another article for that. And then we have a really great article on the overall like IT pro and developer experience that has links to tons of other articles. So that's another really good starting point if you just want to get started and kind of learn about the whole solution. And if you want to get in touch with us, there are 2 really great ways to do that. One is the Commerce Yammer group that we have. So you can go to AKA-MS Commerce Yammer group. If you're already part of our partner program, or customer program, you'll be able to access that. Otherwise, you have to go sign up. And obviously our commerce forum, so you can just post questions, and folks from our core product team and our partner team will answer any questions that you might have. I will check real quick if there is. I'll leave just a couple minutes for our Q&A here at the end real quick. and see if there is any questions. Okay, there's one question that I just see here posted about if you want to synchronize data with your third-party ERP, and I'll go ahead and publish this question, how would that look like? So if I go real back, sorry for the scrolling. If you go back to this architecture diagram at the very beginning, so if you, there are two things that that are really critical here. One is you can even bring your own ERP in reality and basically use that to power your back office, and then your headless commerce will still connect to our back office, but the only for Commerce HQ, like setup and configuration of your channels, not for actual ERP capabilities. But there is a set of integration points that live here in the finance and operations application. So there's an OData endpoint here and another data synchronization framework here, where you can basically, that's what our partner ecosystem usually uses in order to synchronize data into their own ERP solution. So that's a very, very common scenario, and that happens here. There are several articles on like data management. If you go and search for the Dynamics Finance and Operations data management, it'll show you all those integrations and what they look like. And they can be either, again, OData based, meaning real time, or you can have data synchronization via like a SQL connector and other frameworks that you can set up natively there. I hope that answers that question. So yeah, and so I'll publish this question as well. So that is correct. So we have our own chatbot capabilities that we have hosted over here via Power Virtual Agent. But again, as you remember, these components, like the e-commerce storefront, is fully customizable. So, and I just saw someone had posted that question. So you have the ability to go extend it and add your own chat bot capabilities if you like, either for your own implementation of the Power Virtual Agent or for any other third-party chatbot that you might want to roll out. I see one other question here about the performance benchmarks for the commerce scale unit. So I'll answer that because it's a very relevant question. So we haven't published currently the performance benchmarks for our commerce scale unit. It's an activity that we usually go through with customers as they onboard to our solution via our FastTrack solution architecture team. So a FastTrack solution architect will work with you, figure out what your load looks like, and make that decision with you. But we understand that this is a more common question that keeps coming up. So we are actually working on a document that will provide much more prescriptive updates and guidance on what that would look like. So that's a document that you can expect to come out in the next, we hope, month or two, where we will give you very clear, like, hey, based on your footprint, how many scale units do you need? How many stores can you connect to the scale unit? What does your e-commerce load look like? What do you need to split that? Can you reuse the same scale unit across different components or not, including your e-commerce and your in-store? There's another question here from Babak asking whether the real-time service that we have today in Dynamics 365 Commerce is the same as the one in AX 2012, and the answer is yes, it's exactly the same component. It works exactly the same way, but obviously now it's hosted in the cloud. And one really important topic that we didn't get to here because it's a little bit beyond the scope, but we also have two components that we call our N-1 connectors. So if you're an existing AX 2012 customer and you want to start migrating your back office workloads to Dynamics 365, there are two paths in which you can do that. One is if you want to leave your stores on AX 2012 and just upgrade to the cloud for the back office, you can do that by installing these components that will seamlessly make your old AX 2012 POS, whether it's ePOS or MPOS, connect to the new cloud components without actually and you can retire your back office, your AX 2012 back office. But the alternate way we've seen a lot as well, where you might want to migrate your stores to D365 first, and then what you would do is set up a data integration, almost like you would do for any third-party ERP, and have that integration then go back to your AX 2012. So both flavors have happened. Customers have rolled them out successfully, and we have reference implementations, and you can post in our Yammer group if you have any additional questions about that. And So there is one more question about how the upgrade support working for example, if somebody is on 10.09 where they had POS integrations customized and 10.13 comes around, what upgrade is expected on the POS side? So the answer is, and there is an article if you go and search for Dynamics 365 component versioning requirements, it talks about that. So we support you to stay on the same in-store components. And I say in-store because it could be the point of sale or the commerce scale unit that's hosted on the store for up to 12 months. So if you roll out, and 12 calendar months is the equivalent of 8 monthly updates for us because sometimes we skip some. So you can update your e-commerce, your point of sale registers and your in-store components to 10, for example, and you don't have to update them again until we release 10.18. In the meantime, you can continuously update your cloud components. So you can make your commerce scale unit and your finance and operations application update month after month to the latest version without touching your stores. And we as Microsoft guarantee full backwards compatibility, meaning we will make sure that that is fully functioning as long as, again, you follow that versioning requirements, and that article talks a little bit about those details. I take one more question. Can the third-party solution a source of transactional data for CSU, for example, external marketplaces? Yes, absolutely. So you can build an integration. I'll publish this question real quick here. You can absolutely have, if I go back here, you can absolutely have that transactional data be synchronized into the system. You can really do it in two different ways, depending on your scenario, because there is a lot of nuance in exactly what end user scenario you're trying to enable. But you could do it so that this third-party service could either directly integrate with the commerce scale unit, so all your omni-channel scenarios, all your omni-channel apps can just go and read that transactional data in real time. Or if it's more similar to like a ERP integration, you would do it via data integration here on the back office. So you would do this data synchronization that we talked a little bit about earlier when somebody asked about the third-party integration. But that, yes, absolutely. And we have a lot of customers today, for example, that have their own third-party e-commerce solution, but they haven't built their third-party e-commerce solution on top of our commerce scale unit. They have built it, for example, let's say a Shopify, for example, where that's where they go and take the transactions. What they then do is they synchronize that transactional data back into the back office via that data synchronization framework. But once they do, it's now part of this ecosystem. So these customers can do very easily things like BOPIS scenarios, like buy online through my Salesforce Demandware website or my Shopify website, but then come into a Dynamics 365 powered store on the point of sale, recall that order and complete that order with all the payment tokens and all the payment information in a full omni-channel manner without really knowing where that order came from. So that integration works today. We have lots of reference implementations if you're interested. Okay, with that, I will wrap it up and I will give it back to AJ.
Thank you so much. Real quick, I just want to point at the short survey put in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome any input on how we did today and what you'd like to see in future sessions. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on Tech Talk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. And I'd like to extend a thank you to our presenter and thank you to the audience for logging in and joining us today. This concludes today's event.